All right, so we're going to continue with our completing the square method. So the instructions for these are to solve using completing the square. Gotta turn my pen on, there we go. All right, so solve by completing, completing the square. So that's one of our methods for solving quadratic equations. Okay, so looking at example number 8, x squared minus 10x minus 8 equals 0. Our first step is to get our variables on one side, our constant on the other. So I can begin by adding 8 to both sides. So now I have x squared minus 10x, I'm going to leave a little space there, equals 8. And now I have to figure out which value I'm going to add to both sides, which constant, to create a perfect square trinomial on the left-hand side. And remember, we're going to use that b over 2 squared, b over 2 squared, to both sides of the equation. This negative 10 is our b coefficient, so I'm going to take negative 10 over 2 squared, which is equal to negative 5 squared, which is equal to positive 25. So I'm going to add 25 to both sides. And I want to take a quick pause just to point something out. Every time we do the squared step, whether we square a positive or negative constant, we're going to get a positive constant out, right? So we're always adding something positive. So I just want to point that out, whether b is positive or negative. That c term, that constant term, we're always going to add a positive constant term. Okay, so from here, I'm going to factor on the left-hand side, which gives me x minus 5 squared equals, why isn't it typing? Sorry guys. Quick break. Number 11. No! Alright. Wait for it, okay. Why isn't my pen writing? Annotate, boom. There we go, that was weird. Okay, so x minus 5 squared equals 33, 8 plus 25. Now we're going to use that square root property. So I take the square root of both sides, but remember to include your plus or minus at that step. So here we have x minus 5 on the left equals plus or minus square root of 33. And then our final step, I'm going to solve for x, so I'm going to add 5 to both sides. So this gives me x equals positive 5, so just 5, plus or minus square root of 33. So a couple of options for how you can write that differently, although I would just recommend writing it just as I did. That's a great form. You could also write it as 2 solutions separated by a comma, so 5 plus square root of 33, comma, 5 minus square root of 33. That's a correct way to write this. Or if for some reason you want to change the order of your terms, you could also say positive or negative square root of 33 plus 5, and that's okay. What's not okay is if you try and mush these together, and if you write something like, there we go, if you write something like plus or minus 5 square root of 33, that's no longer the same value. So just be aware of that. The plus or minus are in front of that square root, they're in front of that radical. So as long as you keep the signs in front of your terms, you can switch the order, that's fine. You can separate them out into 2 solutions, that's fine. But don't arbitrarily squish them together because that's a totally different result. Okay, so going on to number 9, we're going to do another warm-up exercise where we're just completing the perfect square trinomial. But here we're going to bring in our friends' fractions. So starting with our top left example, x squared plus x plus blank. We want to fill that in with a constant that's going to create a perfect square trinomial. So remember, we're going to take our b coefficient, and in this case, that would be 1, so b equals 1. So I'm going to take b, which is 1, divided by 2, and square it. So I've just got 1/2 or 0.5 or whatever you want to call it, but I can't really simplify inside the parentheses, so I'm just going to go ahead and square the top. 1 squared is 1, and square the denominator. 2 squared is 4. So the constant that I want to add is 1/4. All right, so I just created a perfect square trinomial, and now I need to write it in factored form. And just rewinding real fast to number 8 before we factor this, I want to remind you guys about a little trick. So up here when we had x squared minus 10x plus 25, that's easy enough to factor and get x minus 5 squared, right? That's not too complicated, hopefully. I want to point out, though, that whatever is inside your parentheses here, negative 10 divided by 2 squared equals negative 5 squared. Whatever result you get after you divide by 2, that's also going to appear inside your factored form. So we're going to use a little bit of a cheat here because it's kind of tricky to factor this when we have fractions involved. But what happened when we divided by 2? Well, 1 divided by 2 squared, that's 1/2. So when I write my factored form, I'm going to have x and then positive 1/2 squared. So that's a little trick that you can use to cheat off of if you're having trouble factoring when we bring these fractions into the mix. Okay, bottom left example, x squared minus 3x plus, and then we want to fill that in with a constant. B is negative 3 in this example. Negative 3. So I'm going to take negative 3 divided by 2 and square it. Negative 3 in parentheses squared gives me positive 9. 2 in parentheses squared in the denominator gives me 4, so 9/4. So I'm going to add 9/4 here to create a perfect square trinomial. When I go to factor this, I know that I have a minus sign here, so this is going to be x minus something squared. And remember that I can use that little cheat. Negative 3 divided by 2, my result after I divide a b by 2, that's always going to be what appears inside my parentheses. So negative 3/2, x minus 3/2 squared. All right, over here, switch colors. So negative 5 is my b coefficient. So showing my work up here, negative 5 over 2 squared equals positive 25 over 4. So I'm going to add 25/4 to create a perfect square trinomial. And then when I go to factor that, x and then minus 5/2 squared. And again, that negative 5/2 comes from dividing by 2. Oop, let me choose a different color. I'll go here again. All right, so now we have b equals 3/2. b equals 3/2. So now we want b divided by 2 squared. So first let's just work on what b divided by 2 is. b divided by 2 equals 3/2 divided by 2. And to take a fraction and divide it by 2, we can rewrite this as 3/2 times the reciprocal of 2, 1/2. So we end up with 3/4. Okay. So b divided by 2 squared is 3/2 divided by 2 squared, which is the same thing as 3/4 squared, which gives me 9/16. So 9/16 is the constant I'm going to add to create that perfect square trinomial. And writing this in my factored form, I'll have x. I'll have a plus sign here. And remember that I'm going to use my result after dividing by 2. 3/2 divided by 2 gave me 3/4. So x plus 3/4 squared is my factored form. Here's that. Okay. So let's take a look at number 10. And let me kind of cordon this off a little bit. Sorry, I bled down in there a little bit. All right, so we've got x squared minus 3x plus 5 equals 0. We want to solve that equation using completing the square. First, I'm going to move my constant over to the right-hand side of the equation. So I have x squared minus 3x equals -5. And now I want to take -3, divide it by 2, and square it. I already did that up here, right? X squared minus 3x, and I decided that I'm going to add 9/4 to both sides. So I'm just cheating off of that table up above. So I'm going to add 9/4, add 9/4, and add 9/4. And I know from up above that my factored form on the left-hand side will now be x minus 3/2 squared. So on the right-hand side, I just need to work on adding -5 plus 9/4. So of course, -5, I can make that a -5 over 1. And then I need a common denominator, so I can multiply the numerator and denominator by 4. So instead of -5, I can rewrite that as -20 over 4 plus 9/4. So that adds to -11 over 4. All right, so x minus 3/2 squared equals -11 over 4. Now I apply the square root property. Bring down my plus or minus. So on the left-hand side, we just have x minus 3/2, nothing too bad. On the right-hand side, we have plus or minus. And by the quotient rule, I can split this up into the square root of -11 over the square root of 4. So that gives me plus or minus. Up top, the square root of -11, all I can do is pull out my I. So I have I square root of +11 divided by square root of 4, which is 2. So pulling this together, at this point I have x minus 3/2 equals plus or minus, and I'm just going to rewrite this to make it look a little prettier as square root of 11 over 2 as the coefficient in front of I. And then final step, I need to solve for x, so I'm going to add 3/2 to both sides. So x equals 3/2 plus or minus square root of 11 over 2, and then my I out front. This is my real part, this is my imaginary part. And by the way, just so you're aware, it's also fine if you write your solution as x equals 3/2 plus or minus, and then you could keep that I up top, I square root of 11 over 2, that'd be fine as well. Okay. All right, so moving down to number 11. Solve by completing the square. 2x squared plus 3x plus 4 equals 0. So first we're going to move that constant over to the right by subtracting 4 from both sides. So 2x squared plus 3x, and I'm going to leave a space, equals -4. Okay, so remember with completing the square, the next step that we've just been skipping this whole time because it didn't apply is if you have a coefficient of x squared that's not a 1, then you need to divide by that coefficient. So this is where this comes into play. We have 2x squared, so we need to divide out that 2. And when we do that, we're going to divide every single term that we see by 2. So now I have x squared plus 3/2 x, leave a space there, equals -4 divided by 2, which is -2. All right, now I'm going to take my b coefficient, which is positive 3/2. I'm going to divide that by 2 and square it. Remember that we already did that up here. So we already did the work for number 11 right here. So remember, that's all this stuff in gray. We took 3/2, we divided 3/2 by 2, we got 3/4, we squared 3/4, and we ended up with 9/16. Okay, so we did all this before. So I'm going to add my constant 9/16 to both sides. Okay, and then on the left-hand side, I'll factor And remember that my factored form is going to be x and then plus 3/4 squared. On the right-hand side, we need to go ahead and add -2 plus 9/16. To add, I'll make -2 a -2/1. Got my common denominator by multiplying top and bottom by 16. So I have -32/16 plus 9/16. -32 plus 9 gives me -23 with a 16 in the denominator. So x plus 3/4 squared equals -23/16. All right, square root property. Square root property, don't forget your plus or minus. So x plus 3/4 equals plus or minus, and really similar to what happened with number 10 with our square root of -11/4. Up top, all I can do is pull out my I, and then I have I square root of 23. In my denominator, the square root of 16 gives me 4. And then my final step, subtract 3/4. Subtract 3/4. So final answer, x equals -3/4 plus or minus. And I can just make it look a little prettier by writing square root of 23/4 and then my I out front.